Welcome to this roundup. With each day passing, cybercrimes keep rising. With millions of annual cyber attacks, cybercrime has become a real threat to anyone using computers, smartphones, tablets, Internet of Things, and many other gadgets connected to the Internet. So, as we move rapidly towards one of the most open societies in a world that is more connected than ever before without the necessary security framework and infrastructure in cyberspace, it is not only the cyberspace that is at risk, geospace and space are also at risk. Since cyberspace has brought us all a security threat that blurs the boundaries of not only cyberspace, geospace, and space, but also the boundaries of nations, its government, industries, organizations, and academia. The emerging security threats as a result has no visible front, borders, or armies. As a result, it is important that we evaluate new developments and new platforms in cybersecurity. While we still do not fully understand the complex computer networks and their weak vulnerable points, there is a growing belief that a blockchain integration and consensus mechanism of verification is possible and it will take us on a path towards security. So, to discuss blockchain and cybersecurity further, I'm delighted to welcome David Carvalho to this roundup. David is the CEO of Naoris and is based in United Kingdom. Welcome, David. We are so very honored to have you on Risk Roundup.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Wonderful, David. So, today, cyberspace is deeply embedded across day to day lives of individuals as well as entities across nations, its government, industries, organizations, and academia. And as a result, its crowded interconnections are bringing very complex, chaotic, and challenging times for everyone. No one is secure across nations. So, what vulnerabilities from cyberspace do you think are creating these complex security challenges for the current systems that we have across nations?
Right. Thank you very much for that question. That's a very encompassing question. In my opinion, I think that the majority of risks that come out are just the natural consequence of complexity of environments. Regardless if we're talking about organizations or nation states or critical infrastructure, or even individuals at home, it is clear that, how can I say, human development, technology development has been increasing to a point where it leads us to a situation of extreme complexity. So current environments do not operate well with extreme complexity. I mean, they do operate from a usability perspective, but they do not operate well from a management, security, confidentiality perspective and security in general. I mean, there can be many areas of security. There's several domains to it, from cryptography to anti-malware to network security, etc. So as this complexity grows up and as we go into the fourth industrial revolution, can I say the IoT, the IIoT, now bringing forward, as the world is the fifth, the 5G as well. All of these devices that were historically not made for security, they were made at best for usability, are going to be accessible with high-speed internet. So their threats and risks are going to be multiplied as well around that. So this is just merely a consequence of progress. So we need basically to achieve a solution to this moving forward, because the current status is not maintainable. Current threats are too high. As you know, it's very common to see huge breaches on the news constantly, from, I don't know, the one that happened in Equifax, where hundreds of millions of credit cards were lost to cyber criminals, to many others, even including nation states, and in regards to cyberwar as well, which is a theme that I tend to be quite connected to as well from a personal and business perspective. So from my perspective, when you mentioned during your intro the blockchain and the consensus mechanism to, let's say, kind of like rule them all, then it's clear to me that that passes as and how can I say, right now, probably the most encompassing and robust potential solution towards solving future problems. As how can I say, there is not a lot of discussion about this on the internet, but actually blockchain can also be used to generate lots of threats within this system or the current systems, and only a blockchain-based solution could tackle that. I can speak a little bit deeper on this as we move forward, but this is the generalistic answer.
No, absolutely. No, I think that's a great background and understanding you provided. And when cyberspace fundamentally changes the definition and meaning of security because of all these, developments that are happening, there is no such thing as secure anymore. And if, as we know, we are discussing, if we incorporate that into geospace and space and the complex security challenges, it just, hits the roof. So when the security concept is currently being subjected to big changes with its respect to its aims or capabilities, sources, connectivity, and the dimension of threats, it makes us wonder how the many unknowns of cybersecurity are influencing the average cost of information and data breach. As you just talked about the data breaches. So as we look at blockchain, how do you see security community benefit from the technology integration and fix their security vulnerabilities?
I see a huge benefit from it. So pretty much transversally. Regarding what you said, I agree completely. And I would say that if there's something that's true around cybersecurity or the cybersecurity space, is that for the last 30 years, 35 years, in effect, nothing has changed. The approaches have been pretty much similar. They have been based on, can I say, singular points of failure. I mean, the more the business grows, the more devices they have, the more budgets they have, obviously, also for cybersecurity. But the more devices, servers, partners, complexity they have, the more vulnerable they become. And this is, as you were mentioning before, it is transversal across industries. It's transversal across environments that are very conscious of security and environments that are not. So for people at home, all the way to agencies or even nation states, critical infrastructure, highly regulated industry like banks, etc., all suffer from these threats. Blockchain pretty much changes the paradigm there. Because it allows us to achieve solutions that were not possible before, from a level of, from a perspective of trust and resilience that were impossible as well before, and all backed at the same time by very strong cryptography that's recursive and recursively validated, and based on, how can I say, generalized consensus that's based on different mechanisms, probably for different threat levels. But moving forward, that is clear that, to me, that the way that cybersecurity is going to, how can I say, be done in the future and be approached has to fundamentally change. We cannot be in a situation where the only thing that you expect is always the attacker to win every time. And that has been the situation for the last 35 years. That is the singular truth about cybersecurity. It's just a question of time. Yes. Budget also almost is not a factor in a way. It stops automated attacks and many other attack vectors, but it does not necessarily make you safe. So cybersecurity comes into the fray from a very academic perspective. So cybersecurity is a very nascent technology. It has been maturing quite well in the last years. And we at Naoris fundamentally believe that such technology will continue to evolve. And we're going to continue to use, how can I say, the best technology surrounding it, or the best techniques that it will provide us in order to achieve bigger speed, bigger trust, bigger resilience, bigger security, not just for the blockchain, but for the services that it tries to protect. But to try to give you, how can I say, a different example on how it actually changes the paradigm that we have. Because in my opinion, and as I write very clearly in our white paper, it fundamentally flips the nature of cybersecurity as we know it. So when we have environments, as we were mentioning before, that are very complex at the moment, and that have many, many devices and many IoT devices and systems, virtual, physical, etc., mobile phones, laptops, servers, cloud, third parties, cybersecurity vendors, and many other vendors. This complexity creates a multiple layer of vulnerability, of threat, of risk that was never there before. And as we try to, how can I say, expand our networks and make them more usable, we also create a lot more complexity that's hard to manage. It's very hard to protect, very expensive. And for an attacker, it's quite easy to, how can I say, find one of those systems vulnerable, how can I say, exploit that system, or exploit a human that has access to a system, and move laterally across the organization and even their third parties, and just leave off the land, as it's called. The amount of time of living off the land, by the way, around the world varies, but in the US is about 100 days. In Europe is about 240 days, and in Asia it's even worse. So this is the amount of time an attacker is in a system or in a whole organization, owning all sorts of data and all accesses, pretty much limited to their own imagination, before they're even detected. And usually they're detected by a third party, and it's very, very, very hard to even kick them out. If you rebuild all your systems, you're still not sure if you slipped out or not. So cybersecurity changes with blockchain in this context fundamentally, because the more systems exist in an environment, the more complex that is. That environment, when transformed into a sidechain or a blockchain, what we call verge clusters, becomes as resilient exponentially as the number of devices on it. Not just on it, but also off it. So let's say this is an arm of a blockchain. The rest of the other blockchains that are, part of the universal blockchain of security will verify, all sorts of cybersecurity transactions or related critical transactions that the system has within it. So as an attacker, when I exploit the system that is, how can I say, a random server from some random company, it's very easy for me to actually move laterally and own the business after a while. But by employing techniques that the blockchain actually allows us to do, we can stop this cascading event from happening, and we can reduce that detection factor from about 100 days to, in best case scenario, or never, who knows, to about a second, which is the time that the environment takes to achieve consensus on a truth, a cryptographic truth that has changed. So let's, given the example of, for example, a business that has 5,000 devices, which is really easy to have, by the way, it wouldn't be a big business. But it could be a very critical business. If you think about maybe a nuclear power station or something like that, are usually targets of cyber war and things like that, or other critical infrastructure. Right now, every single device there is a single point of failure. It's a point of entry for the attacker. But when they are within an environment that shares, how can I say, security information regarding critical areas, critical applications, critical libraries, critical accesses to systems, when any of these rules, cryptographic rules, are broken by an attacker, regardless of the techniques that he uses, there will not be consensus on the environment regarding the change that happened. So integrity is the key here. So the blockchain actually operates very well on top of integrity. Integrity is also almost mathematically perfect. When either something has integrity or it doesn't, there is nothing in between. So the blockchain actually allows us to do cybersecurity in a different way that looks at integrity in a democratized, distributed format within our ecosystem. So when integrity changes in a system, we know that's very critical. Let's say a system that, for example, controls the nuclear power plant core temperature. We know that we can no longer trust that system. We might not know what the threat is, but we know that an action needs to be done immediately or needs to be achieved through consensus by the blockchain, if there is rules in order to subvert attacks of that magnitude, to take care of that threat immediately. Otherwise, we would have a situation of, for example, a 0 day that would be there, and we wouldn't know about it because, traditionally for us to deal with the problem, we need to know what that problem is. But in this context, we don't need to know what that problem is. We just need to know that that system is fine. And if it is not fine, then for an attack to happen, something needs to change there in some critical areas. That consensus, that source of truth would be universally known. So that attack would be universally known through the blockchain, and the blockchain would conclude that that is not cryptographically acceptable. Therefore, it would, create a fix or de-risk that situation immediately. Of course, for the attacker, given the blockchain is present in a system like ours, it would be exponentially harder for him to do something, because instead of him just attacking that system and winning, he would have to attack all systems at the same time, break all the encryption at the same time, attack all the nodes and all the verifiers at the same time. And our verification is done in a kind of like in a different way than most blockchains verifications is. Actually, random validators are chosen. So you would actually have to own the whole infrastructure of infrastructures beforehand in order to attack a single system. And you would have to do that probably in some milliseconds. So that makes it very much impossible at the moment from an academic perspective to do. And this is really our perspective around fully transforming the world of cybersecurity as we know it. So it's a complete transformation, let's say. It's a jump on its head of the current paradigm. And this can be also achieved, and we have already a ready product that we have, partners working with, multi-billion-dollar companies, and also militaries, nation-state governance structures, and other critical environments that are naturally very interested in this. That actually fundamentally changes their approach to cybersecurity, not just from a perspective of their own security, but from a perspective of their third-party security. Because the blockchain in this context is also used for maintenance of standards, not just internally, because you can actually prove that every machine in your organization is actually following, all the technical best practices from an ISO 27001 perspective, or whatever other perspective it could be. It could be HIPAA in case of healthcare and others, NIST, etc. This is very hard to subvert because it's a cryptographic truth that is shared through the blockchain. So you can find issues instantly and fix them instantly using automation and different levels of artificial intelligence, regardless of how many systems you have on your network. So you leverage your complexity towards your benefit, right? The more complexity there is, the more you thrive, and the more secure you become. And the same thing for your third parties as well, because you are suddenly able to audit them from a cybersecurity perspective, best practice perspective, and even SLAs that they have with yourself, without sending an auditor in. You can audit them instantly through the blockchain in a cryptographically, verifiable manner that is very, very hard to break instantly at every point. And this is done through a way that is anonymous and agnostic. So as you have seen in our white paper, you can actually know that your partner is not following an SLA with you cryptographically because something got broken. But you have no way to know through the blockchain if that partner, what is, wrong with that partner, or what is the system that is vulnerable, etc. So that gives no advantage to any party in terms of exploiting the system, but it still allows you to enforce best practice or enforce that SLA to the fullest extent, right? But on the partner side, because they are owners of their own sidechain, their own Verge cluster, they will have all the information to go and fix it. So you are able to do that in a way that was never possible before. So now we're talking about different domains of cybersecurity and even audit and compliance that the blockchain comes and has the huge capability of completely revolutionizing from a time perspective, from a trust perspective, because we're talking about very strong cryptography here, even with quantum resistance, and also from a perspective of sharing that truth with other parties, let's say regulators or something like that, and while maintaining security across the framework or the ecosystem.
Sure. No, I think that's a great, background that you gave on this initiative. But what do you think should be the goal of the cybersecurity industry as the efforts to integrate with blockchain begins? Because there, like we see, the cybersecurity is very broad, and it's not only the antiviruses or the viruses or malwares that we are after, but also the vulnerabilities in the IoTs, vulnerabilities in the processes, vulnerabilities in the technology, so many different and the people problems that comes within any entity. So as you go forward, how do you see your initiative being enforced across any corporation, small or big, or any organization or academia, or irrespective of which component of a nation we are talking about? How do you see them benefiting from the blockchain that you are developing, or rather the system that you are developing for the cybersecurity, where they would benefit and how they would benefit if they are all interested in getting on your blockchain?
Right. So I think there's two parts to this. One is the fact that I firmly believe that regulation will catch up on this. I firmly believe that in a number of years, hopefully not a lot, we will see, how can I say, main standards around cybersecurity actually demanding that you have, how can I say, a distributed approach to cybersecurity, right? That you have a distributed approach to identity management, that you have a distributed approach to audit, that you have a blockchain-based approach to network security, to log management, to the other environments of cybersecurity, the other domains. Right. So I fundamentally think that will happen because the current, how can I say, approach is clearly, despite best efforts, not working. And having into account that there are other threats that will come in also due to other technologies, including blockchain. This is something that, how can I say, if we ignore it, it's to our own detriment. Now, how can companies, businesses, how can I say, critical infrastructure, governments, highly regulated industry, healthcare, and many other environments, banking, benefit from such structures? It's clear that their approach currently is not working. Therefore, the benefits are, when they actually onboard themselves into something like this, are easily seen from a perspective that, it's easy to implement. So you actually don't need to change your environment. So regardless of whatever systems you already have, you don't need to change anything. You can implement these on any operating system in principle. So any Unix-based system, Linux-based system, which are most of the critical servers that exist, in embedded systems and controlling systems, so command control environments as well, for example, talking about SCADA systems and critical infrastructure, and also in Windows environments. Of course, when I mention Unix and Linux, I'm not forgetting the mobile devices. So currently, this environment works in all these formats. The onboarding is very simple also, because there is no appliances to be created or needed on these environments. There's no need to add a rack server somewhere, or a blade somewhere, or a virtual appliance somewhere. The approach is based on a software deployment, and that can be distributed regardless of how many devices exist in your network through either, in case of Linux and Unix, a package distribution service, or by Windows updates, for example, in case of Windows systems, to the workforce, or your mobile management service. from that point on, rules will be defined within the systems. So the organization that wants to benefit from such an approach will define what matters to them. Will basically define what are their crown jewels, what really is critical, what's business critical for them, what are the business critical applications, what are the business critical databases, the business critical servers. So the level of granularity is pretty much defined by the end client. This could be, we can be looking at, for example, whole networks or even clusters of systems, or we can be looking at things as minute as, for example, a certain executable and the libraries that it is calling for a certain application, right? It is, our approach is very much an open approach. It's not, how can I say, one box to fix it all. It is the customer that will define what really matters to him, to what extent it really matters, and that will in the end be critical, because consensus within the chain will be achieved to different levels based on criticality and based on response that's needed for that criticality. So as an example, let's say that I define all my, critical servers that control SCADA systems in a dam as supercritical, right? So, for example, when some sort of breach or can I say an escalation of privilege or an exploit happens in that system, or even unknown malware, for example, it happens, and this could be anything. It could be anybody making someone from the company making a mistake that could be critical, all the way to, for example, a nation-state level attack. The system answer would be achieved through consensus. Now, because this is a very critical system, the company would define, how can I say, consensus-related answers to this that would be achieved in under a second. And these answers could be, since it's a very critical system, it would probably fail over somewhere else without any outage, right? Without any loss of data, etc. That would be because they would already be following certain standards regarding ISO and stuff like that. They would already, in NIST, they would already be having like redundancy on this system. How can I say, backups, time-based backups, etc. So they would have a lot of mirrors of this system as well. So we could either, fail it over instantly or something like that in order to achieve maximum security on this system, and then go and use other tools, for example, after the de-risking process, to see from a forensics perspective where the threat came from. But, for example, if you want to look at, for example, mobiles, let's say the company has, 5,000 or 10,000 mobiles, maybe you would have that in a lower threat level. And the rules that you would apply there for consensus mechanism from a blockchain perspective would be more related to, as this mobile phone being breached, as it, for example, being jailbroken, so you can no longer trust it. As it's been rooted in case of Android phones, and you can no longer trust it. And as an application being installed there that it shouldn't be, that breaks your policy, for example. So in that situation, you could very well just literally, just wipe the phone, or achieve consensus in the sense that you would kick the phone out of the network, so you don't need to worry about it anymore. You can no longer join your network, for example. Of course, those solutions couldn't be applied in a more critical environment because it could risk an outage. But it is for the customer to define where their critical environment lies and where the non or medium critical environments live and what they are and what are the solutions that they see according to their own policy from a compliance perspective and internal policy perspective to actually deal with these threats. So if you think about what we're doing from a perspective of comparison, think about, for example, database sellers or vendors. They sell you a database, right? But it's up to you to put whatever you want inside and to make the relationships. So again, it's not one size fits all. So in our approach, it's very much the same, except we're doing it for cybersecurity across all domains of cybersecurity, pretty much, by using a universal consensus mechanism that brings a level of truth, trust, and resiliency that was never possible before with traditional techniques outside of a blockchain.
Sure. No, that is what, we are hoping for as we redefine and redesign the systems, that the trust is there, transparency is there, and integrity is there, so that everyone can believe in the systems that are out there. Now, as you talked, about the devices, I'm wondering, many of these devices, brings in risks that have interconnectedness and interdependency. So how will your system that you're talking about will manage those device interconnectedness and interdependencies, risks that are emerging from that?
Right. So there's a lot to say about that. So, for example, if you talk about, let's say, IoT, right? IoT is a good example because everything is possible within it. You can have cameras, you can have sensors, you can have all sorts of things. Ideally, these systems are not going to be managed directly because if you can imagine, like a company, it's easy for a company that have many buildings to have all sorts of sensors and cameras and maybe machine learning cameras and all things that are going on there, like to manage all sorts of things that are connected to their network. And if they manage each one, with the tool from the vendor, it's going to be very hard to manage. So there are several vendors that have been coming out, for example, with methods to actually manage that centrally, which is great. But that system that centralized system becomes a huge single point of failure, right? So from my approach, we need to onboard that system into, how can I say, an environment of consensus regarding the security of that system itself. So if you can trust that system, and if all device management, how can I say, even embedded systems are managed from that command and control system, just pretty much like happens with SCADA environments in big industry, you should be able to achieve a level of security that's not really known at the moment. So while many systems are not, how can I say, possible to onboard blockchain into directly, you can still secure them by consequence, by securing the systems that manage them.
Yes, no, I that makes sense. So now, as the system works on many of these devices, let's say, irrespective of whether it's IoT devices or, mobiles or laptops, desktop, any of these devices, as the devices are used and as your system is implemented on them, and as it gathers more and more data, and it gathers more and more information about the cybersecurity, risks that they see emerging, how will the cybersecurity intelligence, will move forward and will be transferred to the right owners, or transferred to the right stakeholders, to let them know that the security risks are emerging and that they should be more aware about it? So is there any mechanism to notify or to gather the cybersecurity intelligence, or is it, only to manage the risk in silo that your system is approaching?
Mm-hmm. So from the approach, there's two parts to my answer to your question. So our approach to siloed systems as they are at the moment is to unsilo them, to make them part of an ecosystem through a protocol. On this process, or by doing this process, we get to a point where all these systems are in a situation where their cybersecurity is guaranteed by all the others. Now, if you don't mind, just for me to make sure that I am answering the question correctly, repeat the first part of your question. So, because I'm not absolutely sure what you meant.
As we implement anybody implements your blockchain, anybody that is on your system, blockchain system, any of the devices, any of the entities.
Oh, from an intelligence perspective, sorry. Yeah. Okay, so I actually wanted to answer that a little bit different. So that would be a little bit, that's a different sort of intelligence. So the intelligence or the threat intelligence that exists today is an intelligence based on hearsay. And based on Styx, Taxi, and other protocols, and also, how can I say, people that are basically doing grunt work, and also, in the deep web, in the clear web, looking at forums and gathering intel. But that the main part through bots that basically gather all this information from the ClearNet in all the paste pins and things like that, and in the deep web in all the forums, and correlate this information machine learning style. But the intelligence that we would be providing, due to the fact that we actually gather security telemetry from these systems in an anonymous and agnostic way, is a very different kind of intelligence. So because we are talking about a blockchain that has several sidechains to it, each side cluster or Verge cluster can be actually made of other Verge clusters. So in the case of, let's say, for example, electricity. So let's say that we have electrical power stations, companies. And they would naturally be all inside one Verge cluster, because their policies would be more or less similar, their risks would be more or less similar, and their systems would be more or less similar. They would be all using lots of SCADA and PLC devices, and they would also be quite critical environments, and they would have to follow probably very similar international standards or even internal standards. So it makes sense to do that. In the case that there is a threat that is found either through our environment or through other environments, that threat would basically be onboarded or be part of the, how can I say, pool of knowledge that our swarm-based AI would have. And all the parties of these, for example, so let's say that there's a very specific system inside this environment that is shared by all these companies, has been breached or has suffered an attack recently. A warning would be sent to the other parties too. Of course, because of the nature of the blockchain, it would be impossible for an observer to say where that happened, who was the company that actually got attacked, etc. Due to the fact that we are using a technology called ZK Snarks, which means zero proof of knowledge. We can actually cryptographically prove that something happened in a system that is also shared with others, let's say. But we know that that's bad and we know that's the right system, but we have no idea of proving what that system is or who it belongs to, right? So that protects or takes away the liability from that environment, and it improves the security of everywhere else, right? Which is really what we would like to have these days. But it's whenever there's a risk, nobody will share that risk, especially if it is a known risk. So if you have a company that has been breached in a certain way, that company will probably not say anything unless they are mandated by law to say so. And they will not give any details. Therefore, if there is, for example, a fault in the SWIFT system, for example, in the banking environment, as there was a couple of years ago, the bank that has been breached, or the central bank that has been breached, is not going to say anything about it because it reflects very poorly on them. But our environment allows, in the end, for these things to be not, let's say, not shared, but cryptographically allow for cryptographic-based warnings based on anonymity, because the system itself doesn't know where that threat comes. Only the owner of that Verge cluster, that means only the owner of that network, will know. Nobody else.
I see. No, that at least there is a embedded warning system, which is a good, thing to go forward with. So as your system gets implemented on, devices, or irrespective of which entities across industries or, governments or any organizations or academia, what variables in technology or, what changes in technology or processes would be essential for your system to be effective to manage the security?
It won't need any more changes than already exist. We are approaching this whole problematic from a perspective of, there is already quite a lot of management in cybersecurity. We don't need more. What we need is, of course, these traditional rules to be followed. This just happens to be a system that sits right there on top of all these rules, and that can achieve security from a traditional manner in a completely distributed format, right? Bringing forth the advantages that such environments bring, as you mentioned, the trust, the transparency when needed, the cryptographic validity of things. So for a company in terms of procedure, process, policy, etc., they won't need probably new ones. They would just have to, how can I say, implement this tool. As I mentioned, it's quite easy to do. There's no need to change anything on the ecosystem that exists. It just kind of like becomes a new layer. It becomes a new protocol that exists there that needs to be managed.
I see. So, I mean, as you know, that there are many initiatives emerging from across nations, even when we just talk about the cybersecurity. So, as you compare all those initiatives that are emerging for cybersecurity using the integration with blockchain, how would you define and describe your Naoris approach to security? In how it is, what are its strengths and where are its weaknesses, as you compare that with other systems that are emerging.
Mm-hmm. So I'm not absolutely sure which systems you're talking about regarding emergence. If you can be a bit more clear.
There are several blockchain initiatives emerging in United States, in other countries.
Okay, yeah, I see what you're saying. Absolutely. Okay, so from that perspective, yes, there are indeed many blockchain-based initiatives emerging. I mean, from helping government processes with blockchains, all the way to helping, for example, banks and industry and such environments to settle transfers.
We are talking specifically about cybersecurity.
With cybersecurity, there have been some, how can I say, there are some plans, but I haven't seen personally any achievements yet on that space. So it's hard for me to compare. But I think the only thing that I have seen in regards to cybersecurity and the blockchain, besides what we are doing, has been, how can I say, something very small in comparison to what we're doing, which is mainly, for example, the storage, online storage, for example. When you store, for example, files online, which is, I think, it's a great thing. It's actually, we are partnering with some of these innovators also. So, for example, from a cloud perspective, from a file storage online perspective, so that these files are, how can I say, integrity is maintained, that to make sure that these files cannot be stolen in a way, because actually the blockchain maintains the files together even across different clouds. So let's say 1/10 of the file would be in a certain cloud and the other 10th in another cloud and the other 10th in another cloud, even though you access the file as a whole. Right, so that's really interesting, and we have been partnering with those. And moving forward, I think from the approach that we here at Naoris and our partners, from a cybersecurity and in a IT management perspective, not just crypto parties, but other parties, but especially crypto parties or crypto-based technology parties or blockchain-based technology parties, have been seeing is that there is more and more how can I say, interest, not just in fund, but also to back and use such technologies moving forward by governments, by critical infrastructure, by military, so on. We ourselves have been contacted heavily on that front. Both from a military perspective all the way to a government how can I say, regulation structures perspective and their agencies, all the way to critical infrastructure and highly regulated industry. Actually, any environment, even healthcare, exchanges, for example, any environment that takes security very seriously, really, is backing such initiatives, not just with how can I say, currency, with money or investment, but also with their own name and brand. Because not just, it's not by chance that you see, for example, the UAE or other countries saying that they want to be crypto governments or they want to be blockchain-based governments. They understand the promise that blockchain brings to such an environment to increase efficiency, to decrease, how can I say, loss and waste, etc. And the same thing is true around the environment of actually assurance, which is what security is supposed to do. Is supposed to ensure that systems continue to back whatever they are supposed to back, businesses in order to sell their cars, or banks to transfer money, or governments to take care of their citizens, right? So we have seen quite a number of, how can I say, contacts coming in from that direction, and a lot of initiatives, and we're very proud of being part of many of them.
Great. No, that's really good news. So, as you go forward with your system and designing, defining, and hopefully implementing soon, where do you see any challenges emerging that you feel that you need to overcome before this could become a reality?
Sure. I mean, I think the biggest challenges from my perspective are related to the blockchain itself. And the maturity of the technology. While there are certain use cases for which it is mature enough, even within the cybersecurity space, that we are leveraging already with quite a level of maturity and very successfully. There are other areas that would need the blockchain to actually become more mature, let's say more quick, more agile, perhaps even easier to use in other things. Also from a perspective of trust, I wouldn't say on the technology, but I would say probably because blockchain is many times associated with how can I say historical malpractice and how can I say hackers using bitcoins, for example, for malicious threat actors using bitcoins for payment, etc. Well, I am. I have to say very positive on that front, and I think that's unfortunately that is happening, yes, of course, but that is not even a drop compared to the traditional environments. Like we are tackling or approaching legislation that doesn't stifle innovation on the traditional environments in order to continue to try and tackle these threats, we need to continue to do the same here. And the promise of blockchain is so big that it makes absolutely no sense to approach, how can I say, an actor on it that's potentially malicious and threat the whole ecosystem innovation or future. And I think that will not happen. So I'm very positive on that front. And I think that despite blockchains having certain vulnerabilities at the moment, there are blockchains that are a little bit more, how can I say, different approaches to blockchain management that allow for 51% attacks and other subversions to happen. Our approach, we are convinced that actually creates a lot more maturity on that sense, from the perspective that we don't use, how can I say, computing power necessarily to validate transactions. We use just pure mathematical validations to do it, and we choose our validators randomly. So it's not, let's say, it's not whoever has the most power that can come together and achieve an answer that might hack the blockchain. The validators never know if they are going to be chosen to validate something. There's quite a bit more about that in our white paper as well.
No,
but yeah, there's been a number of threats that have been mitigated by our approaches, but the blockchain's technology themselves are also improving quite quickly. So we are going to pretty much go hand in hand with several big, how can I say, world-level blockchain infrastructure partners, and really adopt whatever is the best for what we need to achieve at the moment.
So you just said that several threats have already been mitigated by using your approach and system. Can you tell us a little bit more about that if it's not confidential?
So what I mentioned was in terms of so what you said is not false, but what I was mentioning was more regarding to the blockchain workings, the workings of the blockchain itself, right? The vulnerabilities that the blockchain as a system has. right? Because that would be the backbone of the consensus environment and the mechanisms of answering risk.
Absolutely.
But from a cybersecurity perspective, absolutely. Absolutely. So at the moment, we have the capacity, just to give you an example, to find fully undetectable malware, zero-day vulnerabilities, zero-day malware in systems that have our environment on it and achieve consensus on it 100% of the time, under a second. So and that's due to the techniques that we are currently using. As you know, I have also gone into in the white paper. So this is just one of the vertents from which that happens. In other domains that I already talked to you about, for example, regarding audit and compliance and SLA verification, is also very clear from a perspective of data loss prevention as well. So if a certain file appears in a system that it shouldn't be, there will be consensus on deleting it unrecoverably. And this, how can I say, this action will be, or whoever did that, let's say, and their system will be logged through a system that we have created called SPOE, Smart Proof of Existence, into the blockchain, proving cryptographically that something happened in this system by this user. That was related, for example, to some IP leakage, for example, following best practices around ownership passing. So that would eventually be used even on court or for forensics perspectives. So there's a number of things here regarding logging, regarding management of critical applications, etc., that I could speak for a long time, that we can and we are doing at the moment with various multi-billion-dollar partners.
Great, great. No, wonderful. So what would you like to tell our global viewers and listeners, especially the cybersecurity community, as far as your blockchain cybersecurity initiative goes? What would you like to convey? And also the students, the young people who are out there who are really passionate about making a difference, what would you like to tell them? Where should they focus, especially, to join hands or, to join in efforts or initiatives like yours to make a difference, for the security challenges that their nation is facing?
Okay, so there's three things that I'll say. One thing will be about the businesses and the boards. The other will be regarding the students. And the other one will be regarding the cybersecurity ecosystem itself and how people can actually participate. So I'll start with the businesses. So in my career, I have, a big part of it, despite being, how can I say, very passionate about the technical side of cybersecurity, a big part of it was passed at leadership level. So at the CISO level or similar, where my main role was to de-risk businesses from their current risk in boards. So if there's something that the board understands, and this is something I would say to companies, to leaders, is risk. Given historically the truth that fortunately I'm part of, that the cybersecurity environment is constantly evolving, which is a good thing, and a bad thing at the same time, but from a perspective of defense is a good thing. It has been historically easy for, how can I say, decision makers in businesses to take the view that something that is innovative and that reduces them risk and potentially even cost is extremely beneficial to them. So I would say for business leaders to keep their eyes open and their ears open as well, and look at innovation always, of course, by questioning everything, but at the same time by looking at it as really a capability or a promise for de-risking their current risks. And in this context, we believe we are doing exactly that from a very disruptive performance perspective. What I would say to students is that probably the best thing they can do in order to be successful in this space, be it as for example, a pen tester, or as a cybersecurity leader, or a manager, or whatever you would like to do, forensics analyst, whatever it might be, would be to think laterally, to never stop learning, and to go out of your comfort zone and play with things. Don't be afraid of breaking things, because that's really what they're there for. And if you know how to break things, you know how to defend against these things. So just be brave and bold and think laterally. That's mostly what I would say. And to not focus so much perhaps on, how can I say, getting certifications, even though certifications are good and companies want them, and they will get you, good salaries. In order for you to become a good professional, the most important things, in my opinion, and these are the qualities that I look for in people that I hire, is to really be a lateral thinker, because the world will throw you curveballs in cybersecurity every time. And lastly, what I would say to not just companies, but also students and other people that also, can I say, care about the crypto world and blockchain, perhaps, is that they can also participate in our ecosystem by being a validator, by being what we call a secure node, so that they can do it. They do it basically for two reasons. So it's kind of like an environment of validation that is similar to what you would have with mining, in cryptocurrency mining. The only difference is that you wouldn't just be mining coins. You would actually be mining and getting paid for it, by the way, with coins that is backed by value. You would be mining the most valuable asset on the internet, which is cybersecurity.
Yes, very true, very well said, and good advice for those young minds that are out there trying to make a difference, and good information for our global viewers and listeners. So thank you so much, David, for participating in Risk Roundup today, and we appreciate your thoughtful insight on blockchain and cybersecurity, and our global viewers and listeners would benefit tremendously from the information you provided on how blockchain can revolutionize cybersecurity, and what can individuals and entities across nations can do to protect themselves from the growing threat of information and data security. So even if a single individual or entity can protect their information based on the discussion we had today, this Risk Roundup dialogue has been of service, and we thank you for that.
Thank you very much for having me.
Wonderful, David. So Risk Roundup, a global initiative launched by Risk Group, is a security risk reporting for risk emerging from existing and emerging technologies, technology convergence, and transformation happening across cyberspace, geospace, and space. Let's manage the existing and emerging risks together. For more information on the Risk Roundups, to watch the Risk Roundup webcast or hear the Risk Roundup podcast, please go to riskgroupllc.com, and do not forget to subscribe and share. Until next time, I'm Jayashree, host of Risk Roundup, signing off. See you next time. Thank you.